This is Books of Titans, the podcast dedicated to the influences of influencers. The books that have helped shape prominent inventors, business leaders, athletes, intellectuals, scientists, and others. We'll talk about what makes these books such classics and at least attempt to have an intelligent discussion about what makes them so important and influential. Today's episode, we're going to talk about the book Principles by Ray Dalio. As for Ray Dalio, Ray is an American billionaire. He's a hedge fund manager and also a what they call in them their hills a philanthropist. He's the founder of Bridgewater Associates, one of the world's largest hedge funds, hundreds of millions of dollars in assets. Reportedly has a net worth north of 17 billion last check, according to Forbes. Which, again, I wonder how they even make these calculations. I mean, it's interesting. You listen to the interviews with these people, and they're like, "I don't know how much I'm worth." I mean, I guess Forbes might be right. Now, then you have the Donald who protests that he's worth way more than whatever Forbes says, but whatever. But yeah, so Dalio. Big time investor, known as a bit of a maverick in terms of his approach, and has run Bridgewater Associates in some interesting ways. I know he was the CEO. He actually stepped aside to be the co-CEO of Bridgewater for 10 months, and then ultimately then found a replacement, but they'd actually been in a transition period to find a replacement for 7 years. So yeah, that took a little while to find a replacement that could be suitable for Bridgewater. There's actually an interesting Freakonomics interview where he talks about some of those things, as I recall. And the issues with the shakeup there. So we can go ahead and link that in the show notes. But let's go ahead and get to it. Erik, you're the one that read this book, Principles. So I am going to interview you. Let's go ahead and first talk about the basic structure and the thesis of this book. What's this book about? I mean, obviously it's called Principles. And it's by this investor. What's he really getting at? What is Principles about?
Well, it's divided into three parts, which I found interesting because the first part is his bio. So he goes through his starting off as a young kid, but really tying everything into Bridgewater, the company that he started. So things are very tied together throughout the whole book with Bridgewater. So you've got his bio at the beginning, and then you have life principles and then work principles. And those also tie in together, but they're really principles to use at a company. So these are the principles that he shares with his colleagues and those under him at Bridgewater. And they're really the principles that he credits with leading to the success of the company for the 40 years that he was there. So some history, some principles that he uses for living, but they're really more to do with being a good worker, really, in a lot of ways. And then the last one are work principles. So that's the division of the book and what he's going for there. So here's the I guess where the rubber meets the road. Why even have principles, stated principles like this? What's his argument for constructing his life and suggesting that everybody else construct their life according to these specific principles that he says govern the way he lives and also the way he works, and thinks that other people should more or less do the same. Although, as I recall, I've heard him interviewed about this before. He does concede that his principles may not work for everybody, but everybody should have work and life principles that they operate by. Yeah, his point at the beginning of the book, he says, to be principled means to consistently operate with principles that can be clearly explained. So the idea of being a principled person, but for those principles to lead an organization, he talks later about the biggest benefit of principles being to simplify and improve decision making. So kind of that idea of if you've got principles for how you handle certain things, it takes out a lot of the decision making. I know Tim Ferriss talks about this a lot with different guests, where you have the same breakfast every morning just so you don't have to think about it.
Yeah, you eliminate decision fatigue so you can preserve your disciplined decision making for the decisions that really matter. That kind of idea.
Yeah. So I was surprised at the level of detail for the principles. So Jordan Peterson just came out with a book, and it's 12 principles for life. And in this book was like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of principles for life and work. So it's really the guiding. His idea was anytime something happened, he would kind of make a mental note of it and then keep testing it. And then what resulted were these list of principles.
So sort of like Liam Neeson, he makes lists. Make lists.
And that was so that was one of my questions too of the book of the complexity of the lists of principles. Does that take away from the power of the principles? But I mean, it's exhaustive. It goes through a ton of different things and all sorts of different parts that could come up with in a company.
Well, why don't we go ahead and take a look at some of those specifics? So when you're talking about there are these lists of principles that are extremely intricate and extremely involved and detailed, give the listener an example of what you're talking about here.
Okay, so I thought if you asked me this question, I was just going to open up to a random one just to give it an idea, just so it wasn't like one cherry pick, because I do have some of those later on.
Yeah, let's go ahead and just do the soothsaying version.
Okay. Make sure people don't confuse the right to complain, give advice, and openly debate with the right to make decisions. So then that would be like a sub-principle of the main principle. So the main principle of that section is recognize how to get beyond disagreements. So then you've got the sub-principle, and then you've got the sub-principle. So when challenging a decision and or the decision maker, consider the broader context. So it just goes like that. There's the top level ones, and then they just kind of keep going down to where he really covers a lot of what could come up in any day in a company. And what you pointed out at the beginning, where he said, these aren't just principles for take a look at my principles, but don't copy them exactly. It's going to be different for your organization. But these are the ones that came about from his 40 years of work.
Yeah, the interesting thing, so for me, is how do you organize this kind of book? I mean, is this basically just kind of like an extended outline? I mean, again, I haven't looked at the inside of this, so. Basically, is he doing like Roman numeral 1, and then that's indented at a different level from the sub principle below it as another paragraph, or how is this organized? Because I do imagine that this could be a bit of a fire hose if it's just principle after principle.
Yeah, it's organized exactly how you say, and in fact, in the center of the book, he lists out all the principles, just the principles, and in the body content of the book is describing each one of those principles. So you can go to the center of the book and have it look, like the Roman numerals, like you say, but then get more in depth where you give stories and examples and that sort of thing within each of the different principles.
Interesting.
So, and I want to make one note too, that this is something I didn't know going into it. This book is life and work principles, but there's actually going to be another book that he's finishing right now that is going to be investment and economic principles. So this is actually book 1 of 2, which I did not know going into it. But
so if he called this one Principles, what's left for that one?
I don't know, because there's nothing really that says Principles Part 1 or anything on the book.
Interesting.
But
so here's my next question. You've referenced sort of the larger principles, overarching principles that have their own sub principles and so on. Does he have a top level hierarchy? How many principles are on that sort of top level? So that serve as the anchor principles for all the others. So you mentioned that there's hundreds of principles in here, but how many of those are sub principles of larger principles versus the larger principles? How many are on that top level? What are these first order principles? And I'm interested in hearing what they are specifically, if there are few enough to discuss.
So for the life principles, there are 5, and for the work principles, there are 16. But
still got Jordan Peterson beat.
Yeah, but you know how, like in the Bible, where the lawyer asked Jesus what if he can narrow everything down into one law, what would that be? And Jesus gives the answer of one law that covers everything. This one sort of does the same thing, where he starts off the chapter with the main or the most important life principle and work principle. And for life principles, it's really based around the idea of truth telling and being open-minded. So just always being truthful with your answers, and when you're in a meeting, even if somebody's above you, always being sure to tell what's on your mind and not trying to please the boss, that kind of thing. For work principles, his whole goal and all of the work principles, they base around this idea of meritocracy. So his whole goal with his company was to make sure that the best idea rose to the top. And you can see that through the principles, that is going to be a main focus, whether it's talking about governance in the company, or other aspects of the company. It's always going to go back to that. We need to have a place where the best idea wins at the end of the day.
So now, how does this pertain? I know he's talked publicly in the past about radical transparency as a core thing that emerged in his company. That basically he ultimately in Bridgewater, basically they instituted a culture of radical transparency, so that essentially you're supposed to basically say what you think no matter what. Which gets to what you were just saying. How much does he directly address that in his principles in terms of that terminology, or explain how that actually functions in a corporate culture? Because I imagine that for at least some of us, at least some of the audience, and maybe a little bit of each of us, a little bit of a lack of transparency is not always a bad thing when it comes to the workplace. A little bit too much information is a real thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and they had ways of working around that. But yeah, I mean, the big push was that radical transparency. And so one thing I thought was cool, like in meetings, you had to give people 2 minutes to speak. So even if you wanted to cut them off, if you didn't like what they were saying, they still had 2 minutes to get their point across before other people could chime in. And then they would also they had one app where everyone could be on their phone in the meeting and vote in real time. So if they were discussing something, they could kind of do a vote. But the app had 2 different ways about it. One was just a straight up kind of like pro or con for an idea, but the other vote would be weighted towards the the proficiency of the person giving the idea. So if someone had more experience in an area, it would be, their answer would be weighted more, and they would have that answer come through and be able to see both of those. So that was a really cool thing. But more back to the transparency thing. One thing he also did was instituted baseball cards in the company. So each person would have a baseball card. And what that related to on the transparency side was getting the Myers-Briggs or different personality tests like that, and then the baseball card would show what that person's personality was like, what they were good at, what they were not good at. So even going into a meeting and you're seeing these baseball cards, it would just keep that idea of radical transparency going, because here's what everybody's good and bad at. Here's what they've done in the past. And then, yeah, like in the meetings, the whole idea was to get all the ideas on the table and to not have people be scared because there was somebody superior than them in the room. So yeah, he based a lot of things on getting that transparency. He did cover transparency going too far, and so they had principles against that as well. But
that seems like a really tough balance to strike, and something that's a bit more of an art than a principle, a principle thing. But I found an example of radical transparency in Bridgewater, where Dalio has actually shared an email that he got from Jim Haskell, who is who's one of his employees at Bridgewater, after a meeting. And this is the email that he got. Ray, you deserve a D- for your performance today in the meeting. You did not prepare at all because there is no way you could have and been that disorganized. In the future, we would ask you to take some time and prepare, and maybe even I should come up and start talking to you to get you warmed up or something. But we can't let this happen again. If you in any way think my view is wrong, please ask the others or we can talk about it. So this is an employee to the top person in his own company, to the head of the company, writing this email. And Dalio used this as an example of what he wanted from his employees. So, I mean, there's no doubt that he practiced what he preached on that, but it does seem to me that it was a tricky balance to strike there.
Well, and I mean, I'm a very much a people pleaser, and so reading through some of that email in particular, and then different parts of the book, it was just like I was cringing inside. I mean, I can't imagine being a part of a company, and he said it would take people 18 months to get situated in the company to really get their feel, and he was fine letting people go if that was not the culture for them, but the big point was to build that radical transparency. And the reason I guess this book is important, or the reason why these principles have any bearing at all, is because of the success of Bridgewater. And he credits the success to these things, and to radical transparency and the idea of meritocracy and being truthful with each other. And if we look at those results, that company predicted the 1987 market crash, the Monday stock crash. They were up 22% on that day. They predicted the 2008 financial crisis, and they most recently predicted the European zone crisis. So their track record is very good, and he would go into some of those things of how they got to those ideas, and they thought through these things so much and disagreed with each other so much and fought about it to that they would then go in front of the main for the 2008 crisis. They were in front of Bernanke and Geithner, and these people would just be amazed because they weren't hearing these thoughts anywhere else. And same with the Eurozone. Ray and a lot of people in the company went and met with different officials in the Eurozone, and again they had a lot of insight for them, and they were providing information and insight that was not really available anywhere else.
Yeah, I wonder then, so it sounds like the overriding work principle really is this radical transparency. Is that accurate?
Yeah.
So that's
the radical transparency in order to produce the best ideas.
Okay, so radical transparency in order to produce the best ideas is the overriding work principle. What then is the overriding life principle in the book? What governs the rest?
The truthfulness.
So truthfulness. So really, those two are the same. Are really the same coin, right? Mm-hmm. That radical transparency is a workplace application of truthfulness. Mm-hmm. That sounds like it to me. I don't know if he organizes it specifically that way. Are there any other overarching life principles or work principles that are worth bringing into the discussion that maybe just fall just below the level of those?
Well, there's one I wanted to highlight that I thought was interesting, and I wanted to get your thoughts on it as well. And I'm going to find it here. It's on page 343, and it's make sure people give more consideration to others than they demand for themselves. Make sure people give more consideration to others than they demand for themselves. And he says this is a requirement. And I thought it was interesting because, I mean, you read through these principles, and Ray does not say that he's a religious guy, and but what these principles kind of come to is almost a religious framework in a way. It's almost like the wisdom literature that we've seen in some of the other books that we've read. That's what a lot of these principles come across as, and he almost creates a religious framework. But I thought this one was interesting in particular because it's similar to the do unto others how you would have them do to you, but he almost like takes it a different way.
He tweaks it a bit.
He tweaks it. Yeah. To give more consideration for others than yourself. So in this is a work principle. So he's saying in the context of working, you should be more concerned about someone else getting a raise than you getting a raise, or someone else getting a project.
What's the idea that team success? I think what he's trying to do is apply the idea that team success overrides individual success. That if your teammates are doing well, then that's going to ultimately impact you as well. So, it's taking self-interest and trying to reapply that to the team itself and to those around you, in the idea that that's gonna eventually filter back.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And that is a central conviction of a large number of world religious traditions. I mean, you have a large emphasis on this in a number of different bodies of literature and teaching. This idea that again, you reference the golden rule. You get the same kind of thing in Confucianism, but it's usually on the negative. It's usually the negative side of that. The same with Hillel's statement of that. Hillel, the Jewish rabbi, basically says the same thing as the golden rule, but he says, "Do not do unto your neighbor what is harmful, or what you would not want done to you." And similarly with the with Confucianism, with the Confucian perspective on this, it's usually more on the negative side, which is a slightly different way of going about it. But again, that principle of, you have to consider other people as at least like yourself. You have to consider their well-being the way that you would consider your own. Now, it is taking it, I think, to a slightly different level, to a higher level, to say you should be considering their well-being or their benefit before your own. That is, I think, another step above that. But again, you get that in some of those traditions as well, which are reflecting on that, saying, you should, and actually you have this in the New Testament epistles as well. Consider others before yourselves. So yeah, it sounds like he's discovered some of the same principles that had been. It's one of those things I find fascinating. Periodically, you see, things like science discovers X, Y, and Z, and it's like, oh yeah, that's something that basically every religious tradition has said for thousands of years. Interesting that it took you, you took the roundabout way of learning that, but glad you finally got there.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think that principle ties into his radical transparency, though, because if you can be radically transparent and mean, and you can be radically transparent with a concern for others. And his whole goal was to foster that atmosphere of being radically transparent to help somebody. So that email that you read,
constructive criticism in that regard.
Yeah. Right? Yep. Yeah. So that email that you read, that even though it sounds harsh, the end goal of that email was to get Ray to realize what he'd done in the meeting and then to not do that again.
Well, and to call him out to say, listen, we know you, it was obvious you didn't prepare. So don't do that again.
Yeah. And this book, and you and I are going to cover this soon in Thinking Fast and Slow, but it comes up a lot in this book. We have a hard time seeing ourselves.
Oh, yeah.
So when someone does tell the truth to you at the company, you should be listening. And so a lot of the principles keep coming back to that of the transparency, the truth telling is for the good of the company, it's for the good of you, and these things tie together. As you said, he does make that point that you can't have the life principles without the work principles, and you can't have the work principles without the life principles.
Yeah, and actually, it's one of those, again, one of those ancient religious texts have a number of things along this line, but, this idea that the person who is willing to hurt you by telling you the truth is actually the real friend. If so long as they're doing it not to hurt you, but actually to bring improvement and to foster something better out of telling you. So that seems like it seems to me that principle actually should govern the radical truth telling. That should actually be the prime principle. That concern for others, or what I would call love, needs to come first, and then as a byproduct of that, radical transparency is a necessary thing. If you're going to want someone's good, then you're going to tell them where something is falling short, or whatever needs to be done to fix that. So it's interesting. I would put it slightly differently, but obviously he's ranked them the way that he sees their relative emphasis in his own practice, in his own life.
Yeah. Well, and his whole goal of the principle, there's so many principles that it's absurd to think of having these on the wall somewhere at Bridgewater for somebody. Oh, what do I do in this situation? The whole goal of this was, in religious terms, to get it to the person's heart. And the way he talks about that is something that we've seen a lot in the different books of this project, but is for them to be habit forming. So these principles to become habits for people. And it's not a matter of, okay, let's consult the book of principles by Ray, the 500 plus principles, or the 500 page plus principles to find out what we do in this situation. But to have those basic things fueling everything, the radical transparency, idea meritocracy, truth telling, and have those become habits for people, and the culture of the company to where it works. It's not a thinking through everything every single time.
Yeah. So again, that makes sense. Now, beyond that, any other principle, any other passages that stuck out that you think are worth bringing in for the audience? Anybody who might be interested in this book.
One principle and an idea he talked a lot about in line of what we were just talking about was taking these principles and putting them into algorithms. And we hear that a lot, but he it was really, I don't know how he does it. I don't know what that means, what kind of programs he's using. And I think part of what he's going to do is release more of that on his website coming up. But there would be an algorithm for everything, like hiring people, making decisions, but they are all based on the principles. So he would talk about putting these principles into practice, not just through habits, but also through these algorithms, and talking about humans working the best with computers in the sense of having these algorithms help with the decisions, not make the decisions, but assist with those decisions. So I thought that part of the book was really interesting. But just something also, because he started doing this in the 80s, like when you could first start getting computers that would have power enough to do that kind of thing. So he's been a big proponent of algorithms since the beginning, and he credits a lot of the good decisions to these algorithms that he's put together.
Yeah, well, I mean, the thing about it is really an algorithm, as the term is often used, an algorithm is really a way of doing a decision tree.
Yeah, it's like I like to think of it as like if that then this.
Right, it's exactly right. It's a decision tree of if then statements. So depending on what data you have, if you have data that can feed well into the if then kind of statements, then yeah, you can make decisions with an algorithm. The difficulty is always getting reliable data. And especially once people know that there's a given algorithm that's going to make decisions on that basis, the real problem is gaming the system. People have a real tendency to do that.
And what was cool with him, back to your question of other things that stuck out in the book, along with that algorithm thing and what you just said about putting the right data in, I remember this coming up in the podcast interview between him and Tim Ferriss. So when Ray was on Ferriss's podcast, he talked about going back to historical periods and trying to find matches for our current times. And obviously that's not perfect and you can get that wrong, but he did it to the point where he would go day by day during the Germany in the 40s. He would go day by day with history books and newspapers to find out what was going economically, and to try to get comparisons to what's going on now or in recent times. He would go back to the Depression, read everything he could about the Depression, look at the daily newspaper during that time to make connections from what he was reading to what was in the daily newspapers, what's going on with stock prices during this time, what's going on in Europe because of the Depression and all these things. So I thought that was really fascinating too. And then anytime he would have a new data point, he would add that to the algorithm, and have that be another key piece to help make decisions going forward and try to identify what was happening now. And I think the results of them predicting a lot of the things that happened in the U.S. in the last 40 years, I think that's a lot of that is testament to his looking at history.
Yeah, interesting. So before we wrap up, what about criticism? Any criticism of his principles here or of the book in general?
Well, a few. One is just it's a 552-page book, and it was interesting. This is a book for an executive, or someone who
for an effective executive.
And he actually you could tell he's read Effective Executive because there's a lot of effective executive talk in the book. But it would either be for someone who's in that position or someone who really, really desires to be in that position, to see how this man ran his company. And one thing Ray continually says throughout the book is, I wish Steve Jobs would have written down his principles. I wish Benjamin Franklin would have written down his principles. So he's a big proponent of having these principles in place.
What's interesting is that Jobs did actually effectively write down his principles, but he kept them in-house. Jobs spent like the last year, particularly the last 6 months or so of his life, essentially putting together Apple, like an Apple University type environment, to try to boil down his principles for how Apple should run and all that, and trying to get that culture so that it would outlive him, which is interesting. But of course, he didn't put it together in a book. He did it for his baby, for Apple, right?
Yeah.
And then Ben Franklin, I mean, he did actually write a number of principles. I mean, you read his almanac, for one, you get a lot of stuff, and then his autobiography has a tremendous amount of his principles, the way that he thinks, though maybe not in the format that Dalio would prefer. So interesting that those would be people he would look at. Yeah.
So first critique is that it's exhaustive. It's super long, and while I was reading this book, my wife and I are reading a book on parenting, and the cover of that book said 14 principles for parenting. And then I see this other bestseller out there right now by Jordan Peterson of 12 principles, 12 rules for life. And you know, these are Ray's rules for life, his principles for life. My criticism is, and it's kind of in the form of a question, but does having so many rules and so many principles take away from the power of them by not distilling those down into the top 12 or something? Because even as you and I were talking, you were saying, well, yeah, these things are all kind of tied together into this idea. So what if he had done that? I mean, I appreciate the extensive lists, and I think it is beneficial for someone who does want to run a company, but it's almost like I keep going back to start with why, of having that one or a few whys in place that kind of guide everything else. And that's my criticism number two is there was never really a why defined in this book. And maybe that's just me liking Start With Why so much and wondering, I wonder why he doesn't have that defined. Because he does talk about the what, he talks about the who, and those things being important, but he never really gets into why Bridgewater, you know, why the company, why the principles, that kind of thing. So that was my second critique. And then my third one is I want to read a sentence and see if anything sticks out to you, Jason. What keeps coming to my mind is Malcolm Gladwell's rule that it takes 10,000 hours of doing something to build expertise.
Uh-oh.
First off,
yeah,
not Malcolm Gladwell's rule.
Yeah.
And then second off,
it's Anders Ericsson's research, and it's not a rule, and it's 10,000 hours of deliberate practice to reach mastery, and that's more of an average, not a rule. Yeah, okay.
So I know that's super picky, and that's on one page out of a 552-page book, but it's like that's but it was also kind of funny because Gladwell really does get credited with that, and not until we read Outliers did I know that was somebody else or listen to a podcast where they interviewed.
Got to give the credit to the Knoll, man. Florida State research shaping the world now.
Yeah.
But yeah, actually, and for those listeners who haven't heard it, we did a full episode actually on Malcolm Gladwell's Outliers, where we discussed that 10,000 hour rule and some of Anders Ericsson's critiques of Gladwell's appropriation of his research in that, and a little bit of a difference in emphasis there, and Gladwell's, I think, reasonable response as well. So that may be interesting for some listeners as well. As one of the first books we actually did. So pardon some of the audio there, but yeah, that may be worth it for some listeners.
Yeah. So, and then just to swing it back to that first critique, I just kept wondering, like, is this necessary? Is it necessary to write out all these rules for your company? Is that better, or is it better to have a few guiding principles? What's the purpose of a mission statement or a vision statement, which Ray doesn't speak about at all, and rightly so. But those guide some companies. So here he's got principles that guide his company. Other people have mission statement, vision statement. Some companies have a really good why statement. What's the relative benefit of having hundreds of principles written out? And that was kind of the question I was left with after reading the book.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, because that sounds like that's the sort of critique that I would have based on what you've said so far as well. So we'll go ahead and wrap it here. Once again, just a reminder that you can follow along with us at booksoftitans.com. All sorts of ways to contact us in the show notes. And if you haven't done so, if you're enjoying this podcast, please rate the podcast, give us 5-star ratings on iTunes or whatever platform you use for your podcast consumption. It definitely helps us out a tremendous amount. We'll be back soon to discuss the next book, which is still in the decision process. It's most likely going to be Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. But once again, this has been the Books of Titans podcast. Keep listening, keep reading, and keep improving.
And keep it real.
Thanks for listening. I made this.